The last part of Chapter 20 that we're going to discuss in class is the second part of that late Renaissance in Mannerism, which is Mannerism. Mannerism is a little bit of a difficult phenomenon to describe. The term itself, in Italian it's called maniera, literally means mannered, meaning extremely graceful, slightly artificial. It also means in the manner of. And we do tend to think that the Mannerist artists are the sort of first generation of artists who are beginning to work in the manner of earlier Renaissance artists or high Renaissance artists, particularly Michelangelo, who becomes a major model for Mannerist artists. I guess before I even explain Mannerism, in a lot of ways we need to look at it. Mannerism seems to upend a lot of what we expect about high Renaissance art. If I say to you just what are the characteristics of high Renaissance, we think of symmetry and balance and order, geometry, perspective, a very idealized interest in anatomy, organized, rational compositions, and all of these things seem to go out the window. Beginning for the first time in the 1520s, we start to see these sort of Mannerist experiments. It's possible, I don't know the reason for this. This shift in style is sometimes seen as part of an artist's response to maybe political and religious tensions that are beginning. This is now the age when the Reformation is beginning. There are political crises throughout Europe. But it may just as well be either a reaction against the Renaissance. In other words, there's only so far certain concepts can go, like balance, order, geometry, perspective, before artists need to find another way to manipulate those ideas. Or it could also just have to do with the particular group of artists involved. The Mannerists, the artists who we group into this loose category, are, in general, eccentric, troubled group of artists, the first of which we'll meet right now. So I show you this work, right, as our sort of introduction to Mannerism. This is a work, it's called The Entombment. It's also sometimes called The Deposition, which maybe is a little bit more accurate, being that we don't actually see a tomb, and Christ's body is appearing to be lowered into the picture plane. The work is by an artist whose name is Pontormo. His name is Jacopo Pontormo, about whom we know quite a bit. Pontormo is a very eccentric artist, suffered from major bouts of depression, paranoia. We know a lot about him because he left behind a diary. It's only 20-something pages, but a handwritten diary, a sort of a daily account book of what was going on in his life. And it's unlike any other artist diary I can think of in that it doesn't usually talk very much about his work. It appears from time to time. But it's mostly a chronicle of how he feels, what he eats, who he talks to. And so the diary will say things like, you know, I woke up on Wednesday, my head hurt. I ate 2 eggs, I went to bed. On Thursday, I ate some cabbage and a bowl of soup. I have a stomach ache. And then it just goes on for pages and pages. His diary also talks about hiding when people came to visit him in his house. And he talks about being depressed, lonely, anxious. And so Pontormo seems to fall into the category of what we sometimes call the melancholic artists. You know, in terms of astrology, it's believed that the artistic temperament, and this is from the Renaissance and earlier, the Renaissance temperament was controlled by the planet Saturn. And the negative side of that sort of temperament is that there's a tendency towards being melancholic, very moody, which was sometimes seen as the artist's response from having so many great ideas and being unable to produce. So he sort of falls into our category of this melancholic artist, and maybe some of his eccentric qualities are what we really do see in his art. So this work is painted for what's called the Capponi Chapel. It's a small family chapel in the Church of Santa Felicita in Florence. It's still there. I can show it to you in situ in a moment. The chapel was actually designed by Brunelleschi. So his painting was meant to very much fit into its environment. So I'll show it to you right now. Okay, so here you can see the picture in its setting. The chapel is Brunelleschi, just whitewashed walls with Pietra Serena, that gray stone molding. And Pontormo was hired to paint two walls. First of all, an altar piece, which is what we see right now. And again, the picture fits its environment in that the scene shows really the descent of Christ from the cross, with his body being lowered in the picture plane, as if it was being lowered onto the altar of the chapel itself. And then there's an adjacent wall that's actually painted in fresco by the artist, with scenes of an Annunciation, so Mary and an angel Gabriel. The little roundels up above are painted both by Pontormo and by his young pupil Branzino, who we'll meet in a moment. So, this is Mannerism. And I guess the first thing, we've seen depositions before. You could think of this next to Roger van der Weyden. And the first thing to think about this picture is how maybe it departs in a lot of ways from what we learned to think about from a Renaissance picture. And so the question is, what do we expect? Since the beginning of this class, we've been talking about hierarchy. And one of the first things we talked about was hierarchy of placement. Where do you put things in a picture when they're the most important part of the picture? And the answer is usually the central axis. We've seen central axes work two ways in this course. Either the central axis as where one puts important information, or a central axis as the dividing line between two halves of a picture. And what's sort of curious, just in terms of composition of this picture, is that when we look at the central axis of the picture, especially the very center point of the picture, sort of put a giant X through the picture, the central axis is marked by nothing important, and the very center of the picture is marked by a void, a series of hands moving through space. But neither Christ nor Mary, his mother, who you see sort of towards the upper right, are positioned in that place. Let's think about other things that we think about for Renaissance. We've been talking a lot about perspective, the use of linear perspective, the rational depiction of space. And here we are with a picture that shows no sense of setting. The only thing that indicates space is that maybe we see some ground at the bottom, we see a single white cloud in the sky, and in fact, it's impossible to actually place these figures into a rational space. Where does Mary sit? Where do the figures stand? Those figures at the top who are leaning into the scene appear to be on some invisible support system, some invisible bleachers. It's almost as if the artist is experimenting in a type like Cimabue from early on in the semester, where forms move up the picture plane as opposed to back, and the artist is actually filling every part of the canvas surface. We can think about other ideas. In Mannerism, so compositions become asymmetrical, space becomes irrational, the treatment of bodies becomes disproportional. Now, any artist growing up in the sort of post-High Renaissance period, and Pontormo's works mostly start appearing in the 1520s, understands anatomy. Other artists who have been understanding this concept have already been working. So while he's training, he's seeing the works of artists like Michelangelo and Leonardo. So here we have these unusual proportions. For example, there's the woman who's seen from the back, standing in that pink, yellow, and red garment, whose head is incredibly small for the size of her body. Her body is many times the head. Usually in classical art, heads are 1/6 or usually 1/7, maybe 1/8 of the body. But here the proportions seem incredibly elongated, and the bodies are also posed irrationally. Notice, for example, the two figures who carry the body of Christ. One of whom faces towards us and carries Christ under his arm. The other one who's crouching, carrying the brunt of Christ's weight on his back. Now that figure's carrying a lot of literally dead weight on his shoulders. And yet look at how he's holding Christ. First of all, the weight doesn't seem to affect the figure. The figures are weightless. So even though both of these figures are carrying tremendous weight, they stand on their toes. And that foreground figure is balancing on their tiptoes. Furthermore, think about where Christ's body is positioned on that figure. Christ's entire torso, both thighs, right, the width of his lower body, is positioned on that figure's shoulder. One shoulder. I have pretty big shoulders for a girl, and I still estimate my shoulders probably like 5 inches. So the pose is impossible, so much so that it displaces that figure's neck. So the neck is out of joint. Even look at the back, which is oddly long and incredibly bent. So the bodies are irrational in terms of their poses, and sometimes the artist even conceals the the body from us. And, okay, I don't know if any of you ever taken photography class. I remember taking a photography class in high school and being given this old photography manual that shows you, like, you know, bad composition techniques for photographs. And one of them was, I'll never forget the photograph of a man standing right in front of a telephone pole, so that the telephone pole looked like it was growing out of his head, you know, as an idea of how not to compose your pictures, to think about the way the figure relates to the background. Look, for example, at the head growing out of Christ's head. So there's this turbaned woman turning away. We can't see any of her body. We don't know where she is in space. We can't conceive of how she fits into the picture. And the artist has irrationally placed her directly behind Christ so that it appears almost to be this monstrous sort of creature growing out of his head. Likewise, the figure right on the central axis in the pink turban looking at Mary, whose body is completely obfuscated. The clothes are atypical as well. That pink leotard worn by the figure at the bottom. The woman at the top who's wearing a, I don't know, like a leotard, an olive green bodysuit. And by the way, even talking about colors is difficult when we talk about mannerism, because traditionally, if you think about chiaroscuro, which we learned about in Renaissance, an artist, we conceive of them, you know, I'm going to make this garment red, and to make shadows you add black to create darker red, and to add highlights you add white to create lighter color, and that's how you model from light to shade. Well, there's very little modeling in this work, and in a lot of Mannerist work. The pictures are flattening. And if you look at the color change, instead of the artist using light and shade to create color change, the artist is using color. So, for example, the woman we see from the back on the right-hand side has a pink backside, but yellow sleeves, and that yellow garment turns red in the shadows. It's not a different garment, it's the same fabric. So colors lose what we call their chromatic identity. Look at the figure in the foreground carrying Christ's legs, and you'll notice that the back of the figure is pink, but the stomach and the arm are highlighted in blue. So again, colors don't retain their identity. The bodies are oddly positioned. And this all sort of leads us to what we consider mannerism. It's incredibly sort of a personal interest, maybe a personal taste of the artist, but it's one that becomes very much favored, and it rejects all of what we consider the most traditional and expected aspects of Renaissance works. By the way, we do see Pontormo in his painting. You'll notice the woman at the top in the olive green points off to the side with her hand and leads us to the side where we see a man in brown with a black hat looking out at the spectator, who is in fact Pontormo looking out at us from his masterpiece. And here I put it up next to Michelangelo because, as I said, the Mannerists were often considered to be working in the manner of Michelangelo, and Michelangelo was a major source of inspiration for a lot of their works. Even if many of the Mannerists are painters, they're looking at sculpture as a model. And you can actually almost see that here, because again, there is no interest really in perspective or landscape or the things that paintings can do that sculpture doesn't do. It's a very sculptural work for all of its lack of shadows. And you can actually see the inspiration here, that Pontormo's picture is sort of like a Pietà interrupted. You know, Mary's in very much the same pose. Christ's body is in the same pose as it was in the Pietà. Look at how his right arm hangs down at the side. The left arm is lifted up by those female attendants just as it's lifted onto Mary's lap in the other work. And so it's almost as if this is the moment after the Pietà, when Christ's body is lifted off of Mary's lap and the figures are moving away. So they tend to choose, these Mannerists, very atypical, either atypical subjects or atypical moments in the subject. But there's always this sense of ambiguity about meaning. I think I could show that to you very clearly. Hold on one second. Take this, for example, as another Mannerist work. And a perfect example, look, Mannerists explore all categories of works. They make religious paintings, many of which get rejected. I mean, some of them are really quite radical and out there. They also make portraits, Mannerist portraits, including one that you may have seen at the Frick, were very popular. Likewise, Mannerists would paint private works, secular works, mythological works, including this one. And this brings up very well the point that Mannerist works are often maybe purposefully obscure. In other words, if the Renaissance work ideally is supposed to be easy to read, you don't think that when Raphael paints a picture, he wants you to sit there and guess about what it means as you look at it. That these seem to be purposefully opaque and challenging. And just like the artist is pursuing difficulties in anatomy and difficulties in color, we sense that they're pursuing difficulties in subject. So this is by an artist whose nickname is Branzino. That's what we call him. It just means red, or copper hair. He had red hair, clearly. Who was a pupil of Pontormo, and a close associate of Pontormo throughout his life. Branzino's another character. He's known for some bawdy erotic poetry, otherwise. And this is a work that he paints for the Medici dukes in Florence, which ultimately gets gifted to the King of France. So it's a private work for a secular patron. We don't really know the meaning of it, right? So we're calling it here an allegory with Venus and Cupid. It goes under several names, but we usually just try to discuss it as an allegory because, again, we don't really know the meaning. And in fact, we don't really know the meaning of many of the figures in the work. The primary subjects are easy to identify, which is why we call it allegory with Venus and Cupid. The primary figures are, in fact, Venus, positioned in a very mannerist way across the picture plane, so that we don't really know how she's holding herself in that posture. That's a pretty hard posture to hold herself in, because her backside doesn't entirely appear to be resting on anything. And she's sort of like splayed out across the front of the picture plane. She almost, again, you sense that mannerists are looking at sculpture, because she looks, in fact, like a sculpture in a lot of ways, come to life, or not. And behind her, Cupid, who is fondling his mother, and kissing her, open mouth, right? So clearly it's an erotic picture. Cupid, by the way, a perfect example again of that mannerist body, in that it is very difficult to see how he holds himself up, and furthermore how his head fits on his body, okay, because the poses are purposefully made difficult and contorted. And while he kisses his mother and fondles her breast, you see Venus, who is disarming Cupid. She's pulling an arrow out of Cupid's quiver. Right? So that's the primary subject that we're looking at. But then there's a whole other host of characters. It's a very mannerist space in that it's a distortion of perspective. We don't really have any deep view here. The figures are all pressed up against the picture plane because of the presence of this bright blue curtain behind the figures. It has been very harshly restored, so some of the very bright coloring is probably not the fault or choice of Branzino, but I'll just put that out there. And so we see some characters behind that are recognizable, most notably Father Time, Kronos, in the upper right-hand corner with wings and an hourglass on his back, who appears to be revealing, or covering, but probably revealing, what's going on between Venus and Cupid. So it's as if he's pulling aside this bright blue curtain with the help of another female figure to the top left. Your book calls her Truth, and so we're made to think that truth and time uncover the doings of love. However, that figure in the top left corner, I disagree heartily with your book in calling her Truth. I would call her Deceit, in that she, in fact, doesn't have a head. She's only a face. She's a mask. And masks are bad signs. In fact, you'll notice that in the opposite corner, that's in the top left, if you look in the lower right-hand corner, there's a pile of masks. Masks are a sign of deception. So perhaps it is that truth is trying to, or time is trying to uncover what deception tries to conceal. And so maybe that also accounts for her expression as she pulls in maybe the opposite direction as Father Time in the top right-hand corner. Then we're left with the scene down below. The figures have been variously identified. The boy with the curly hair and the rose petals walking in from the right-hand side is usually called Folly. The figures behind are trickier. The one on the left-hand side, grabbing her head, is usually called Jealousy or Envy. The one in the middle, the girl's face that's peeking out between Venus and Folly, might be called Fraud. She's been called Inconstancy. And so the meaning of this picture, because we don't know what it is, there's all these symbolic figures and symbolic elements, the doves that are being sort of stepped on by Cupid, the masks, The golden ball held by Venus, though that's probably a symbol either of the Medici family, so the golden balls are appropriate, or a reference to her winning the beauty contest, the Judgment of Paris. Attempts to explain the meaning, I love this. I found this quote somewhere, I don't even know, I don't think it's from your book, but where they just try to string together the words that they see represented in the picture. And so someone described this picture as love, accompanied by envy and inconstancy, is foolish, and that lovers will discover its folly in time. Okay, that's not very helpful. So we have to think about what this picture's about. And what it appears to be about is the dangers of love, the perils of falling for the pleasures of the flesh. It appears in a weird way, even though clearly this was meant for an esoteric sort of audience and someone who liked the erotic nature of it. It seems to be about the dangers of this kind of eroticism. Because Cupid represents love and Venus represents beauty. And here, this is love being disarmed by beauty. In other words, love falls for beauty, but beauty is deceptive, and beauty is disarming love, right, by taking his arrows when he's not looking. All of the other symbols in the picture are a little bit evil. I'll sort of show those to you. Oh, here you can see the fantastic detail of Venus and her son Cupid. You notice Venus has all of her symbols of Venus, the pearls in her hair, another reclining Venus statue in her tiara. The style here is very disegno, very much interested in precise mechanical outlines, right? So no subtlety in terms of blending. There were earlier versions of this picture, by the way, that were edited. I've seen edited versions, like I think at one point the nipple was painted out and the tongue was painted out of Venus's mouth so that it was not as erotic as the picture now is after those overpaintings have been revealed. But even look at the way that Cupid's face is foreshortened. It's overly flattened, and so again, perspective is sort of denied. Now the figure of Folly, the little boy who runs into the picture from the right-hand side, is supposed to be this symbol of pleasure. So he's like celebrating the love of the couple. He's showering them with rose petals, roses being symbols of Venus. He's got jingle bells on his ankle. In other words, it appears to be this sort of joyous figure. And yet, when you look at the detail up close, and this is as good of a detail as I could get, you notice that that figure of Folly is actually stepping on a thorn that's coming through the top of its foot. So the picture is, again, it seems to invoke the idea that love comes with a hefty dose of pain. Now you're also going to notice something else from this detail, which is that that little girl in the center of the picture actually has a rather peculiar body. So let's take a look at that. So here, going back to the whole picture, you see the little girl, their head sticking out. And honestly, she looks exactly like Duke Cosimo I's daughter, Bia, who actually had died when she was very young, but looks just like her from creepy portraits. That's the figure that's usually called fraud or inconstancy, because she's clearly duplicitous. She has a beautiful, charming face. She's got pearls in her hair, much like Venus. And she's holding forward with her hand towards Venus a honeycomb. In other words, things that are pleasurable and sweet. So again, like we imagine love and beauty are, good things. And then when we look behind her, you know, the part of her that pops out on the other side behind Folly, we see that, first of all, she's got a composite body. She's got like griffin feet and lizard tail. And she's holding in her other hand what looks to be a dangerous claw. In other words, again, the notion of beauty and love leading to pain and suffering. And when you look at the little girl, you'll also notice her hands are on backwards. In other words, the hand that's coming out and holding the honeycomb seems to be the wrong arm. So again, she seems to be a sort of monstrous hybrid creature. The last figure that we can think about here, although there's a lot going on, is that figure right behind Cupid, right? That's sort of tearing its hair. And here's just further up closes of the right-hand side compared to the left. And the left-hand side has a figure that's usually called jealousy or envy. I mean, it's an old woman, a hag, who appears to be in great pain or suffering. You know what I've heard, though? There's a very interesting interpretation of this figure, because jealousy or envy isn't necessarily represented here. But what might be is that this picture was painted at a time when venereal disease was rampant. And so the idea, and this whole theme, the theme that love is physically dangerous, and being fooled by beauty could be physically dangerous, fits in with that notion. And so I have read that this figure might be a personification of syphilis, which was the only treatment for syphilis at the time. I think they used mercury, which we now know is poisonous, and it made one's teeth fall out, and it caused excruciating headaches. And so this figure may be a further exemplar of that. So, in a nutshell, with two works of art, that's Mannerism. They're fascinating artists. They're fascinating pictures. They all look very different one from the other. It's not like one set style. But it shows you the way that, you know, there is a pushback from strictly high Renaissance style by the time we get to the late 16th century, as you imagine that there has to be. Now, the last thing I'll show you is, in fact, Michelangelo himself again. Michelangelo, by the time we see him even in the Last Judgment, you already see him exhibiting the characteristics of a Mannerist artist. Some of the distorted, impossible body poses, the increase in muscular form, the greater compression of space with that bright blue ground. But he also becomes a Mannerist architect towards the end of his life. And I'm showing you this because we haven't had a lot of chance to look at architecture. And it is a fantastic space. Although in retrospect, as I put this up, I always realize that this is a phenomenal space that you can't possibly appreciate unless you're in it. So I'll show it to you, and maybe one day you'll find yourself in Florence and you'll go visit the Florentian Library. By the way, the very first time I was in Florence, I was there for one day in 1993, and it's one of the things that was on my hit list because it's important. Michelangelo, towards the end of his career, continues to paint and sculpt, but he really professionally becomes like an architect in a lot of ways. And this shows Michelangelo as a Mannerist, and to show you the way that architecture can be Mannerist as well. And when we say Mannerist now, we're just thinking about the idea that our expectations are subverted. It's the antithesis of what we expect. So he was hired by the Church of San Lorenzo to design and redecorate a vestibule, so a little entry hall, and then the reading room of a library that was part of the monastery. It was a very difficult task because the vestibule, which we're looking at right now, is very narrow and very tall space. It's like a two-story space, but it's very compressed and narrow. And then the reading room is long and low. So the artist had to think about the way those two spaces work together. So at first he's asked to design the vestibule, and obviously he needs to create a staircase to lead up into the reading room. You could see the door in the top right corner of your screen. And his original designs are sort of predictable. Because it's such a small space and you want to maintain some room for people to talk and congregate, Michelangelo planned a double staircase with the stairs hugging the walls and going into the corners, the two opposite corners of the room. So in other words, the center of the room was left blank, the stairs hugged the walls and were minimal, and it was a logical solution to the problem. But Michelangelo doesn't finish this project right away. He's starting to work on it in the 1520s, but in 1534, because of the political climate in Florence, he's more or less forced to leave the city and flee to Rome, which is where he spends the rest of his life. The last 3 decades of his life, he's Florentine, but he's staying exclusively pretty much in Rome. He's not in Florence at all. So he actually completes this design by sending drawings and models back and forth to his assistants in Florence, who then had to create his ideas. The end result is that Michelangelo is using classical architectural elements, but using them in unexpected ways. Even in that picture on the left-hand side, I can show you this. For example, columns. I think traditionally, columns are used to hold up architecture in a very obvious way. In other words, columns really demonstrate their function. And yet when you look at Michelangelo's columns, there are these massive bulging columns, but they're sunken into the wall. They're almost treated like sculpture in niches, and so they don't really appear to support the wall. The wall instead appears to be, or the roof instead appears to be supported by the wall that are in between. And yet those columns really do hold up the ceiling. Those walls are just thin veneers, and they don't do anything. So in other words, Michelangelo doesn't allow the column to appear to have the function it really does. See what I'm saying? Likewise, if you look below the columns, and you can also see this detail on the picture, the color picture on the right, you'll notice these tremendous corbels, these brackets set into the wall, these S-curve brackets, which are used to hold things up. In Michelangelo's sense of architecture, he uses them for nothing. They hold up nothing but themselves. So again, very unexpected treatment of architecture, and even the stairs that he ultimately designs are fantastic. You cannot see this from the photograph. But literally, because I went like bounding into the Laurentian Library, I was so excited to see it. I run up to the monastery, up to the second floor, and like I run into the room and almost literally trip flat on my face in front of these steps. Because the steps take up the whole room. I mean, Michelangelo's plan originally was to put them against the wall, and instead he decides to turn them into a monumental piece of sculpture, and the whole room becomes about the stairs. So as soon as you walk in the door, you are, like, aggressively attacked by the stairs in the middle of the room. It's the antithesis of what one would expect when it comes to logic. Even the stairs aren't unexpected. They're not straight. Think about what makes a safe set of staircase. You know, straight edges, banisters. And here you'll notice there's 3 sets of stairs. One central set of stairs, which has this curving form moving towards you. It's like, it's the antithesis of what you expect. The stairs coming at you as opposed to, you know, being neutral. On the side, the stairs have no railings. And you can see the odd way that at the very edges, the stairs sort of skip a space. So it's uncomfortable. It feels precarious to walk up the staircase. And that banister, by the way, is very low. So there's a sense of unsettling to what we expect to be a very settled space, which is a library. And here you could see the stairs as it feels, more or less in front of them, or a little bit above. And I put up a picture on the right-hand side of a classical temple, just to show you the kind of architecture Michelangelo is quoting. Columns, a pediment, which is that triangular space held up by the columns, which Michelangelo quotes in his door frame, right above the doorway, but the pediment is broken, meaning like you can see the triangles are separated in several parts. They push out over the columns. So very irregular treatment, again, of recognizable form. And here you really see the way the stairs work, which is sort of genius. I think it's a metaphor, because everyone always compares the stairs to a lava flow. You know, in other words, the stairs are spilling out towards you. But it's maybe a metaphor for learning. In other words, the act of getting to the library is arduous. You guys know that. The act of going to the library is you have to make yourself do it. You have to propel yourself. But it's this idea that the attainment of knowledge is challenging. And so it's not easy to move into the space of the library. So there's a sense of tension, of difficulties, like you're fighting the direction that you should be moving in until you enter into the space of the reading room. Oh, that's a good photograph, the bottom left. That's what it feels like to stand in front of these enormous stairs, right? That's from a person's eye view. And I put it up next to a picture of the reading room in the top left corner so that you could see the way Michelangelo contrasted the spaces. So down below, again, it's arduous, it's difficult. You have to watch your step. There's nothing to hold on to. And then there's this tremendous sense of calm and regularity in the reading room. This very repetitive, expected, low horizontal space with perfectly identical windows and no unusual architectural elements. But Michelangelo was trying to create this sense of tension that ultimately results in the release, the serenity of being in this space of learning. It's pretty awesome. So in any case, that's all I'm going to do for 16th century Italy. And when we come back next class, we'll be talking about the 16th century in the north.